This week, we are mourning the end of an era with the passing of Alan Greenspan at the age of 100. And I thought it was appropriate in this week's podcast to do a little bit of a retrospective on the life and times of Alan Greenspan, because so much of what he witnessed during his extraordinary career through multiple presidential administrations and an extended period at the chair of the Federal Reserve are being reflected in the dynamics that we are dealing with here today. And I think it's also appropriate to analyze some of his delightful quotes, which pithily sum up some of the challenges in parsing what central bank governors and chairmen say, and also sometimes how pointless it is to spend as much time as we do on analyzing what they say. When we remember Alan Greenspan, who died at the age of 100, he had been the 18th chair of the Federal Reserve. He presided over the Federal Reserve from 1987 to 2006 and oversaw no less than 17 rate hikes. Some of his wonderful quotes are here, and those of you watching this on the screen can return to this and relish just how perfectly he captured the zeitgeist of his time and the art of deliberate ambiguity in central bank communication, when he famously said, "I know you think you understand what you thought I said, but I'm not sure you realize that what you heard is not what I meant." So this and many other wonderful quotes are attributed to Alan Greenspan. We also should remember that he saw markets ultimately as a series of imbalances, and how forecasting was really an exercise in projecting as to how certain imbalances in markets would resolve. And when we think about the delicate balancing act that the Fed today is conducting between the employment rate, the rate of economic activity, the inflation rate, this is in effect the fine tuning that any central bank is asked to do. And it is when these imbalances persist for too long that we start wondering as to whether the existing tools in the toolkit will be sufficient going forward. So let's look at some of the lessons that Alan Greenspan learned over the course of his career that we can maybe import into salutary reminders of the type of environment that we are dealing with today. So I think it's safe to say that he did, despite writing the book called Irrational Exuberance, he did and the forecasting that would come to a sorry end as it did. There was, in fact, a significant time lag between him speaking about the irrational exuberance and the actual fallout. We've got a chart showing that later. It is safe to say that he oversaw consistent improvements in the three Fed targets. CPI came down over the course of his tenure. The unemployment rate came down over the course of his tenure. And while the 10-year Treasury yield moved around significantly, before and after his tenure, it did come down over the course of his tenure, despite, as I mentioned, him presiding over 17 rate hikes. It was a recession-free era, as the chart on the right shows. If we look at where the GDP growth had been in the US, we see that there were periods of sustained recession, most notably in the aftermath of his era, so around 2008, 2009, and of course in the aftermath of COVID. But during his era at the helm of the Federal Reserve, relatively unbroken patch of economic growth. He also gave rise to the concept of the Greenspan put, which was a belief that the Fed would step in and intervene in order to prop up the stock market. He would intervene in the form of monetary easing. This became known as the Greenspan put. And there was a sense after this that this could have led to some form of moral hazard, that investors would not act prudently, would not conserve their capital and act in a risk management fashion because they knew that the Federal Reserve was always there as a backstop. So I think if we study this chart in a little bit more detail, we can see that the upper band of the Greenspan put really kicked in around the time of the long-term capital management crisis in 1998, 1999. So that was really a precursor of the crisis that would hit markets 10 years later. We can see that the S&P relative to the Bloomberg Treasury was still rising at that time. He was not able to prevent the market fall, but he was, notwithstanding, able, this is in the aftermath of 99 into 2000, 2002, but he was able to shore up some of the demand and ultimately turn that around through being able to cut rates preemptively. So hence the Greenspan put and that sense of central bank intervention being born. The other interesting concept around his tenure was the fact that despite having cut rates significantly and then continued to actually raise them towards the end of his tenure, there was very little movement in the 10-year yield. It stayed more or less stable. This is where we have seen the 10-year, that there was a relatively flattening of the yield curve around the end of his tenure. I think what he realized is no matter how much he moved interest rates up, as we can see here at the end of his tenure, it didn't have much effect on the 10-year yield, suggesting that there is only so much that monetary policy can do. And we've seen this in the recent spate of Fed monetary policy. We've seen that despite the steady rise in rate hikes and the aftermath of the COVID low rate era, it didn't make a huge difference in terms of both the 10-year, which stayed relatively stable. We did have an inverted yield curve for some time and then a flattening. And equally, nor did it make much difference to ultimately investors' spending activity or saving activity. It was relatively slow transmission effect. Some of this was due to the locked-in fixed-rate mortgages, but we did have a relative disconnect between Fed policy and the impact on markets. And this was what he deemed a conundrum, in that despite, as it's shown here in the gray bar on the right of the chart, despite raising rates, he was not able to get the 10-year to budge. The other thing I said is that although he sounded the alarm about irrational exuberance, that was sounded back in 1996, there was ultimately a 4-year wait period until the bursting of the bubble in 2000. There was, of course, a further effect in 2008, but it just goes to show the potential for markets staying irrational far after experts experienced in markets have made the case for exuberance. This is again another salutary reminder of some of the calls of exuberance today, as we know that there is perhaps some disconnect between some claims of a froth in AI and the fact that markets continue, with the exception of a few wobbles over the course of this week, generally march forward with some positive momentum.